She had spent years deciding who belonged. Margaret Hill was a woman of quiet authority. A senior flight attendant who knew the rules, enforced them without question, and never once considered that her judgments could be wrong. But on one particular flight, at 35,000 feet, she made a decision, one that would change everything. A teenage girl, a first-class seat, a single assumption. Margaret saw Layla Monroe and decided, without hesitation, that she didn't belong. She didn't check the manifest. She didn't ask questions. She simply told the girl to move. And she thought that would be the end of it. But what she didn't know was that Layla Monroe wasn't just any passenger. She was the daughter of Elijah Monroe, the man who owned the airline. And now, with the entire world watching, Margaret was about to face a reckoning she never saw coming. Would she walk away from the damage she caused? Or would she be forced to confront the truth of who she really was? Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you love stories where justice is served, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get into it. The hum of the airport was a familiar sound, rolling suitcases, hushed voices murmuring in anticipation, the occasional outburst from a child too tired to contain their frustration. Layla Monroe sat at the gate, watching the digital clock tick closer to boarding time, her ticket pressed between her fingers like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. First class. She had never flown first class before. Her father had given her the ticket as a reward, a gesture of pride in his daughter's hard work. But even now, sitting there in the waiting area surrounded by businessmen in tailored suits and women with designer handbags, she felt the weight of an unspoken expectation pressing against her. She shifted in her seat, adjusted the hoodie she wore over her jeans, and tapped her fingers against the armrest. People walked past her without a glance, except for the occasional lingering look that lasted just a second too long. The kind of look that asked a question without words. Are you sure you belong here? The boarding call. When the announcement came over the speakers, she stood, gripping her bag tightly, and walked to the gate. The attendant, a woman with a bright smile and a polished uniform, barely looked at her as she scanned Layla's ticket. Monroe, first class, she read, pausing just slightly before nodding. Enjoy your flight. Layla exhaled. The first hurdle crossed. Stepping onto the plane, she felt the immediate shift in atmosphere. First class was quieter, almost unnervingly so. Plush seats lined the cabin, each space an island of comfort and exclusivity. She found hers a window seat, just as she had imagined. She tucked her bag under the seat, settled in, and let out a slow breath. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. The interruption. The flight attendant came down the aisle, her presence sharp and efficient. Layla noticed her from the moment she entered her section. Something about the woman's movements was different when she approached her row, more deliberate, more searching. Then, she stopped. Layla looked up, meeting the woman's gaze. Miss, I believe you're in the wrong section. Her voice was firm, but not unkind, at least. Not yet. Layla frowned, confused. No, I don't think so, she said, reaching into her hoodie pocket and pulling out her ticket. This is my seat. The woman, her name tag read Margaret Hill, took the ticket from Layla's hand, scanned it, and hesitated, not because she had found a problem, but because she hadn't. Layla saw it then, the flicker of something behind the woman's eyes. It wasn't about the seat. It was about her sitting in it. Margaret handed the ticket back, her smile thin. There's been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers. Layla felt the heat rise to her face. I am a first-class passenger. The words came out steady, but the quiet around them felt louder than before. The businessman across the aisle glanced over, then quickly looked away. The older couple 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke, but everyone was listening. Margaret folded her arms. Where are your parents? Layla blinked. I'm traveling alone. The woman's smile tightened. And who gave you this ticket? Layla's fingers curled against her lap. My father. Margaret let out a small breath, as if she had just confirmed something she had suspected. Miss Monroe, I'm going to have to ask you to move. The moment stretched too long. Silence pressing against her ribs. She could feel it happening. The slow unraveling of the moment, turning from confusion into humiliation. She could stand her ground. She could fight. But Layla already knew how this worked. She had seen it before at stores, in restaurants, in parking lots when someone assumed her father's car didn't belong to him. She had seen it in the way teachers were surprised when she was the top student in class. She had seen it in the way security guards lingered just a second too long when she walked through certain neighborhoods. And now, she was seeing it here. The problem wasn't the ticket. It was that she had it. The decision. Her breath felt shallow. She looked around, searching for a face, for an ally. No one moved. No one said anything. The businessman across the aisle checked his watch. The couple 2 rows up adjusted their blankets. Margaret was waiting. Layla swallowed hard, forced her hands to steady as she reached for her bag. She stood, not because she wasn't angry, not because she wasn't right, but because she already knew fighting wouldn't change anything. She walked down the aisle, head held high, not letting her steps falter. But inside, she was burning. She took her seat in economy, stuffing her bag under the chair, fingers trembling. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Her phone buzzed. Dad, everything okay? Boarded yet? Layla stared at the screen, then exhaled. Her father had always told her to stand up for herself, that she had the right to take up space. But he had also told her that some fights weren't fought with words. She typed back, her fingers moving slow but certain. Layla, they made me move. Said I couldn't sit in first class. There was a pause. Then another buzz. Dad, who made you move? Layla's grip on her phone tightened. Layla, the flight attendant. The next response came faster. Dad, what's the flight number? Her heart pounded. She told him. This wasn't over. The plane had taken off, its engines roaring as it ascended into the sky, pressing Layla back against the stiff fabric of her economy class seat. The city lights below grew smaller and smaller, blurring into a sea of golden veins, winding between the darkness of streets and neighborhoods. She should have been looking out the window of her first-class seat, sipping the orange juice she had planned to order, stretching her legs out in the comfort of the space her father had paid for. Instead, she sat crammed between 2 strangers, her knees knocking against the hard plastic of the tray table in front of her. Her fingers curled around her phone, the screen still illuminated with the last message from her father. Dad, what's the flight number? Her reply had been sent. Now, she waited. The power of silence. The plane was silent except for the hum of the engines. Passengers had settled into their routines, some reading, others dozing off, a few scrolling through their phones. Layla sat perfectly still. She didn't need to move. She didn't need to speak. The injustice had already spoken for itself. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed the rules. She had played by the book. And yet, here she was, sitting in the section where they thought she belonged. Not where she had belonged. Not where her ticket had placed her. No, here where no one would question her presence. She stared down at her hands, remembering how Margaret had looked at her, evaluated her, decided for her that she did not belong. How quickly that moment had happened. How effortlessly she had been dismissed. And how easily everyone around her had let it happen. She glanced toward the front of the plane, toward the first-class section, separated from her by a thick curtain. The division felt more than physical, it was something else. Something deeper. Something that had been written into the very fabric of this country long before she had ever set foot on this plane. The weight of assumptions. Somewhere up there, Margaret was probably walking the aisle with a tray, pouring wine, greeting passengers with warm smiles. Layla could imagine it clearly how the woman's demeanor had shifted when she had seen her. How quickly the professional smile had vanished, replaced with doubt, suspicion. Margaret had not seen a paying passenger. She had not seen a young woman who had earned her seat. She had seen someone who didn't fit. And the moment she had seen Layla, she had decided, there must have been a mistake. Layla had felt this before. This sinking, familiar sensation. It wasn't always outright, not always loud. It was in the small things. The passing moments, the unspoken assumptions. The teacher who had once asked if she was sure she was in the right honors class. The store clerk who had followed her father a little too closely in a department store. The neighbor who had eyed their house suspiciously when they first moved in. It was always there, living in the spaces between words, lingering in the moments when people thought they were being polite but were really being honest. And now, here it was again, the first strike. Her phone vibrated in her lap. Dad, stay calm, I'm handling it. Layla inhaled sharply, exhaling slowly through her nose. If her father said he was handling it, Then he was handling it. She wasn't sure what that meant. But she knew one thing: her father had built his success from the ground up. He wasn't just any man. He was a man who knew how to move pieces on the board without ever raising his voice. And right now, she had a feeling that Margaret Hill had no idea whose seat she had stolen. The first shift. At the front of the plane, Margaret was refilling a passenger's champagne glass when a voice came over her earpiece. "Margaret, the captain needs to see you in the cockpit. Now." She stiffened. The captain? Calling her? That never happened. Margaret glanced down the aisle, toward the other flight attendants. They were watching her now. Small, curious glances over their shoulders. She forced a smile, gave a polite nod to the passengers in front of her, and turned toward the front of the plane. The walk felt longer than usual, her pulse a little quicker, her hands pressing against the fabric of her uniform. Something was wrong. The captain's orders. When she entered the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was seated in his chair, his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. On the screen of the in-flight phone, a man's face was visible. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, sharp, focused eyes. It took her only a second to recognize him. Elijah Monroe, the owner of the airline. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "Miss Hill," Captain Reynolds said smoothly, not looking away from the screen. "We've received a complaint about a first-class passenger being improperly removed from her seat." Margaret opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, but before she could say anything, Elijah Monroe spoke. His voice was calm, deliberate. "You removed my daughter from her seat." The air in the cockpit seemed to shrink. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Daughter. His daughter. She had made a mistake, a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. "You told her she didn't belong in first class. You dismissed her paid ticket and publicly humiliated her in front of other passengers. Would you like to explain why?" Margaret felt heat rise up her neck. "I was just following protocol," she stammered. "There must have been an error." "There was," Elijah interrupted, "but it wasn't in the ticketing system." The words hit hard, cold and sharp. Captain Reynolds folded his hands in front of him. "Mr. Monroe has instructed us to correct this mistake immediately." Margaret's throat tightened. The realization was setting in. She wasn't in control anymore. For the first time in her career, the rules were being rewritten. And she was no longer the one holding the pen. The walk of reckoning. As Margaret stepped out of the cockpit, her hands clenched at her sides. The other flight attendants watched as she walked down the aisle. The whispers had already begun. Passengers had noticed her being called away. And now, as she made her way toward the back of the plane, toward Layla, the weight of what was happening settled deep in her chest. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about power. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Hill realized she was no longer the one holding it. Margaret Hill walked back through the plane, her steps slower than before, her breath coming in shallow, uneven waves. The first-class passengers barely looked up from their glasses of wine, their pristine silverware clinking softly against fine china. But the economy-class passengers, they were watching. They had seen her stride down the aisle earlier, brimming with quiet authority, sending Layla Monroe away like a mistake that needed to be corrected. And now, they saw her walking that same path in reverse. But this time, her shoulders were tense, her polished uniform suddenly feeling like it didn't fit quite right. This wasn't just a walk. This was a reckoning. The uneasy quiet. Layla saw her coming before she arrived. She didn't move, didn't shift in her seat. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her spine straight, her chin high. She knew this moment was coming. She had been waiting for it. Margaret stopped just beside her row. The passengers nearest them had turned away, pretending not to listen, but everyone was listening. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Miss Monroe," she said, her voice quieter than before. "There's been a mistake." Layla tilted her head slightly, not answering. Margaret's hands pressed against her uniform. "You're welcome to return to your seat in first class." There, the offer had been made. The scales had been reset. Or so Margaret thought. But Layla wasn't going to make this easy. She didn't move, didn't gather her things, didn't even acknowledge the request at first. Instead, she let the silence settle, thick and heavy, until Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Then, finally, Layla spoke. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice calm, controlled. Margaret's lips parted slightly. "Yes, there was. Layla held up a finger. Just one, just enough to stop her. The power had shifted. Tell me, Layla continued, tilting her head slightly, her voice measured. Was there an error with my ticket? Margaret hesitated. No, but did the system tell you my seat was invalid? Number. Layla nodded, letting the answer linger. Margaret was standing in the aisle now, under the weight of dozens of unseen eyes. The whispers had begun, floating through the air like static. Layla could feel it all changing, piece by piece. So, she said, folding her arms, her voice still quiet, still even. What exactly was the mistake? Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. She couldn't say it. She wouldn't say it. But everyone knew. Everyone already knew. The problem had never been the seat. The problem had been who was sitting in it. The crack in the facade. Margaret felt it the way the air had turned against her. She wasn't just facing Layla anymore. She was facing the truth of what she had done. And the worst part? It wasn't even the first time. She had made these kinds of calls before. Small ones, quiet ones, choosing who to greet with warmth and who to treat with cold efficiency. Choosing who to scrutinize and who to let pass without a second glance. But this time, she had been caught, and she wasn't in control anymore. I misjudged the situation, she said quickly, her fingers twitching at her sides. I should have checked the manifest before making an assumption. I apologize. Layla held her gaze, unreadable. Then, slowly, she stood. Margaret exhaled slightly in relief, thinking the moment was over. But Layla wasn't done. She reached for her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped into the aisle, her presence suddenly larger than before. Passengers in the surrounding rows were staring now, silent and still. Layla turned to Margaret. Walk with me. Margaret blinked. I what? Walk with me. Back to my seat. Margaret stiffened. She had planned to let Layla slip back into first class quietly. Let this all fade into the background. Let time erase what had happened. But Layla was forcing her to be seen. Layla wanted the people who had watched her humiliation to see her reinstatement. Margaret swallowed. This wasn't just an apology anymore. This was a public reckoning. The walk of retribution. Layla moved, and Margaret followed, step by step, through the rows of passengers who had witnessed the moment she had been forced to give up her seat. Through the weight of every stare, every hushed conversation, every unspoken realization that had settled in the air. And then they reached it. The first class section. The curtain swayed slightly as Layla stepped through it, crossing the invisible threshold back into the space where she had always belonged. Passengers turned as she entered. Some of them looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their books, their drinks, their conversations. Others held her gaze, their eyes tinged with something resembling guilt. Layla reached her seat. She sat down, adjusting her bag beside her, moving with a deliberate, quiet grace. Margaret hovered nearby, unsure of what to do next. She had delivered Layla to her rightful seat. She had done what was asked. But Layla wasn't done. She looked up at her. Anything else? She asked. Voice unreadable. Margaret swallowed. If there's anything you need, please let me know. Layla studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Sure, she said, reaching for her seatbelt. I'll let you know. With that, Layla turned away, lifting a magazine from the seat pocket in front of her, flipping the pages as if the whole event had been nothing more than an inconvenience. But everyone on that plane knew better. Margaret turned, walking back toward the galley, her face burning. She could feel it, whispers curling through the air like smoke, the weight of every step heavier than the last. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And she had a sinking feeling that, for the first time in her life, she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of an assumption. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. A perfect picture of order and precision. A floating city in the sky where the world below seemed distant, insignificant. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. It was in the way people stole glances, the way their fingers hesitated before pressing the call button, the way conversations hushed when certain people walked by. Margaret Hill felt it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't direct, but it was there. The quiet judgment, the eyes that flicked toward her and then away. The whispered conversations between flight attendants who had been working alongside her for years but now saw her differently. She had walked this aisle 1,000 times. With confidence, with control. Now, each step felt heavier than the last. The captain's voice. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please remain seated and ensure that your seatbelts are fastened." Margaret exhaled, gripping the edge of the galley counter. Just a little longer. Just land the plane. Finish the shift. And the in-flight phone rang. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She already knew who it was. With a shaky breath, she lifted the receiver to her ear. "This is Miss Hill." The voice on the other end was deep. "Steady. This is Elijah Monroe." Margaret felt her hands go clammy. "You will remain on board after landing," he continued, his voice betraying nothing. "Security will be waiting to escort you for a formal inquiry." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "Mr. Monroe, I." Click. The call ended. She stood there, the dial tone humming in her ear. She had been dismissed. The passenger's verdict. Margaret turned, her mind spinning, her body moving on autopilot. She stepped back into the first-class section, where Layla sat, calm and composed, flipping through the in-flight magazine as if nothing had happened. But there was something in the way she held herself unshaken, unbothered, that made Margaret's stomach turn. Layla wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the passenger, the one whose name would be in the reports, the one whose father owned the sky they were flying through, the one who had forced her to confront something Margaret had spent years ignoring. And the worst part? Layla hadn't even raised her voice. Margaret had worked flights where passengers threw tantrums over cold coffee, where businessmen barked at flight attendants for not refilling their drinks fast enough, where privilege was loud and demanding. But Layla? Layla had been quiet. She had let the moment breathe. Let the truth settle. Let it echo. Let it be known without ever needing to force it. And that silence? That silence had undone Margaret Hill more than any argument ever could. She was still staring when a voice interrupted her. "Miss Hill." Margaret blinked, turning toward the source. Richard Evans, the businessman who had watched everything unfold earlier, sat a few rows away, his hands folded over his lap. He was an older man, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that had the effortless polish of wealth that never had to explain itself. His voice was quiet, not confrontational, not aggressive, but there was something in his eyes. Something unreadable. Margaret swallowed. "Yes, sir?" Richard leaned forward slightly. "I saw what happened earlier," he said. Margaret's chest tightened. "I suppose we all did," he added, gesturing vaguely to the cabin. She looked around. He was right. They had all seen it. And not one of them had spoken up. Not when it mattered. Not when Layla needed them to. Not until now. Margaret opened her mouth, but Richard continued. "I just wanted to say," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "that must have been embarrassing." Margaret stiffened. It was a statement, not a question. He was testing her. She knew it, and she had no response. Because he was right. It was embarrassing. Not just the apology. Not just the walk of shame. The realization. The knowing. The sudden, unavoidable truth that she wasn't the person she thought she was. She had told herself, for years, that she was fair, that she followed protocol, that she was simply doing her job. But now she saw it. Not just what had happened today, but all the other moments. The subtle ones. The ones she had dismissed. A mother with 2 kids in economy who had asked for an extra blanket, only for Margaret to assume she was trying to get something for free. The black businessman in first class she had asked twice if he was in the right seat, just to be sure. The countless, tiny judgments she had made over the years, so small she had convinced herself they didn't exist. But they did. And now, they were staring back at her, waiting to see what she would do. The descent begins. Margaret turned away, heart pounding, as she walked back to the galley. The first-class curtain whispered shut behind her, cutting her off from the world that had once been hers. She gripped the counter, eyes locked on her trembling hands. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be examined, to be judged, to be the one who didn't belong. The flight attendants nearby exchanged glances but said nothing. They knew. They all knew. The plane began its descent. And with it, Margaret felt something inside her drop. Too. She had spent years deciding where people belonged. But today, she had been the one who was out of place. And when those landing wheels hit the ground, she knew. Her fall was just beginning. The plane touched down, wheels screeching against the tarmac, sending a tremor through the cabin. A collective breath seemed to release among the passengers, some stretching, some reaching for their overhead luggage, others merely bracing for the next motion of the journey. But for Margaret Hill, the landing was not a relief. It was a sentence. She remained in the galley, her hands pressed against the cool metal counter, listening to the sounds of movement. A flight attendant beside her, Hannah Miller, gave her a look, part curiosity, part knowing. Margaret didn't acknowledge it. She didn't have to. She already knew what Hannah was thinking, what the entire crew was thinking. Margaret, the woman who had always been so sure of her authority, the woman who had always been the enforcer of rules, was now the one waiting to be escorted off the plane. The waiting game. She could hear them, the first-class passengers leaving first, their voices casual, their conversations easy, as if nothing had happened on this flight, as if the world outside this plane was still the same as when they had boarded. She could hear the shuffle of passengers in economy, the polite thank yous murmured to the other flight attendants. And then there was her, waiting, alone, waiting for the door to close behind the last passenger, waiting for security, waiting for the moment where she would no longer be in control of where she went next. It had been years, decades, even since she had last felt powerless, since she had felt like the one being judged. And yet, here she was, the passenger who wouldn't leave quietly. She heard movement near the front of the plane, footsteps slow but deliberate. Then, a voice, calm, measured, unbothered. Still here? Margaret turned. Layla Monroe stood in the aisle, her bag slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Layla tilted her head slightly. "I thought I'd see if you needed anything before I left," she said, her tone laced with something just sharp enough to be noticed. "You know, since you were so concerned about my seating arrangement earlier." Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. Passengers were still filing out, some pausing just for a second when they saw Layla standing there, their eyes flicking between the teenager and the woman who had tried to remove her. Layla studied her for a long moment. Then, she smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a smug one, just knowing. "I guess I'll see you around," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag. Or maybe not. And with that, she turned and walked off the plane, disappearing into the jet bridge, where her father Elijah Monroe was surely waiting. Margaret exhaled shakily. Layla had said nothing overtly threatening. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. And yet, Margaret had never felt smaller. The security detail. The last passenger left. The doors shut. The cabin, once filled with murmurs and shuffling feet, was now silent. Margaret braced herself. And then, a new set of footsteps. Not hurried, not rushed, deliberate. She turned. A uniformed officer stood at the entrance of the cabin, flanked by a man in a dark suit. He didn't have to say her name. She knew. "Miss Hill," the officer said smoothly, nodding toward the jet bridge. Margaret hesitated for just a second, but she had no room to argue. The weight of her choices was pressing down now, each step heavier than the last. Hannah, still standing by the beverage cart, gave her a look, one that almost felt pitying. Margaret ignored it. She walked. The aisle that she had controlled for so many years, the aisle where she had made judgments, now felt endless. Each row of seats was a reminder. Each flicker of an eye from a remaining crew member was a verdict. She stepped onto the jet bridge. The air cooler now, fresher, like the world outside had already moved on without her. And there, standing just beyond security, was Elijah Monroe. Waiting, watching. Margaret's stomach turned. She was no longer a flight attendant in this moment. She was just another person who had made the wrong assumption about the wrong man's daughter. And now, she was going to pay for it. The walk of reckoning. She kept walking, her head held high, because what else could she do? But as she passed Elijah Monroe, she made the mistake of looking up, of meeting his eyes. They were calm, steady, measured, and yet, within them, she saw the weight of history. Of every man who had ever been told he didn't belong. Of every woman who had ever been turned away. Of every assumption that had ever been made about a person because of who they were. Elijah Monroe didn't need to say anything. His silence was a sentence. Margaret turned away. The doors of the airport loomed ahead. Her fate, whatever it was, waited beyond them. And for the first time in her career, in her life, she had no control over what came next. Margaret Hill had spent her entire career believing she understood power. She had felt it in the way passengers obeyed her instructions. In the way her voice alone could make a grown man remove his carry-on from the overhead bin without question. She had wielded it in the simple motion of a raised eyebrow. In the clipped tone of a well-practiced phrase, "Sir, you need to return to your seat." "Ma'am, that's not allowed." "Miss, I believe you're in the wrong section." Power had been in her uniform, in her polished shoes, in the way she stood tall in the aisle, commanding attention without asking for it. But now, she sat in a cold, sterile conference room at Carter Aviation's corporate headquarters, staring at her trembling hands, stripped of all of it. The power she had once carried so effortlessly was gone. Because power was never hers to begin with. It had always belonged to those above her, to the ones she had never met, to the people in rooms like this, with their glass tables and silent judgments. And now, those people were about to decide what came next. The man at the head of the table, Elijah Monroe, sat across from her. Not behind a desk, not flanked by lawyers, just him, seated calmly, his hands folded in front of him, the weight of his presence filling the space. Beside him, Layla Monroe sat as well, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Margaret had expected anger. She had expected raised voices, accusations, demands. Instead, she was met with something far worse. Silence. Measured, unshaken. The kind of silence that told her that no matter what she said, no matter what excuses she reached for, nothing would erase what had happened on that flight. Nothing would take away what she had done. The hum of the air conditioning filled the space. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance. Finally, Elijah spoke. "Miss Hill," he said, his voice steady, "why do you think you're here?" Margaret opened her mouth, the words already forming. "There was a misunderstanding. I was just following protocol." But then she saw it. The way Layla tilted her head slightly, waiting. The way Elijah's gaze remained unwavering, unbothered by whatever excuse she might try to offer. The way the weight of it all pressed down on her. She closed her mouth, swallowed, and, for the first time in her career, she admitted something she never thought she'd have to. "I made a mistake." The mirror of truth. Elijah didn't move. He didn't nod in approval. He simply let her words hang in the air, forcing her to feel them. Margaret swallowed again. I assumed," she said, her voice quieter now. "I saw Layla in that seat. And I didn't think twice. I didn't check the manifest. I didn't verify anything. I just assumed she wasn't supposed to be there." Layla's lips pressed together. Elijah remained still. Margaret felt the sweat forming at the back of her neck, the cold realization settling deep into her bones. Because the truth was, this had never been about a seat. It had been about a decision. A decision she had made in a matter of seconds. A decision built not on logic, not on protocol, but on something deeper, something she had never been forced to acknowledge before. Elijah sighed, finally leaning forward. "You've been a flight attendant for 10 years. Miss Hill," he said, his voice still maddeningly even. "How many times have you done this before?" Margaret's heart clenched. She wanted to say never. She wanted to say that this was the first time, the only time, an isolated incident. But she knew that wasn't true. So did he. So did Layla. And suddenly, she wasn't just in this room anymore. She was in all the other moments, the ones she had ignored. The ones she had brushed aside. The young black man in business class she had checked twice. The Latina mother with 2 kids who had asked for an extra blanket. Only for Margaret to assume she was trying to get something for free. The countless other small, quiet judgments she had made over the years. So subtle, so automatic, that she had never thought to question them. Until now. "I don't know," Margaret whispered. And it was the most honest thing she had ever said. The weight of a name. Elijah sat back. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "something I need you to hear." Margaret braced herself. "When my grandfather flew for the first time, he wasn't allowed to sit in first class," Elijah said. "It wasn't policy. It wasn't in the rules. But the flight attendants at the time had already decided who belonged and who didn't." Margaret swallowed hard. "My father," Elijah continued, "bought his first-class ticket when he was 35. The airline let him board. But a flight attendant looked at him the way you looked at Layla. And she asked him very politely, of course, if he was sure he was in the right seat." He paused. Margaret could feel the room shrinking around her. "So you see, Miss Hill," Elijah said, his voice finally carrying something close to emotion. Something almost like disappointment. "This isn't just about you. This isn't just about Layla." His eyes locked onto hers. "This is about every person before her who was made to feel like they didn't belong." Margaret's breath hitched. Because she understood. Maybe for the first time in her life. She truly understood. This wasn't just a moment. This was history. This was America. And she had just played her part in it. The verdict. Elijah took a deep breath. "I have every reason to make sure you never work in this industry again," he said. "I could end your career with a single phone call. And if I'm being honest, I haven't decided if I should." Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "You see, I believe in accountability," he continued, "but I also believe in fairness. And right now, you have a choice." Margaret stiffened. Elijah slid a document across the table. "You can walk away, resign, find another airline, start over somewhere else, pretend this never happened. Or," he paused, watching her carefully, "you take the next few months and do the work. Real training, real bias education, real accountability. And if, and only if, you prove that you've changed, we will consider reinstating you." Margaret felt her throat close up. The easier choice was obvious. To walk away, to move on, to escape this moment and bury it deep, somewhere where she never had to look at it again. But that wasn't really a choice. Was it? Because if she did that, if she refused to face the truth of who she had been, she would never be able to escape the weight of it. Her hands trembled as she reached for the pen. She didn't know if she could change. But she knew she had to try. And so, she signed. Because for the first time in her life, Margaret Hill wasn't the one deciding where someone belonged. She was the one fighting to belong. Margaret Hill had always thought of herself as a good person. She paid her taxes. She sent money to her niece for college. She had never to her knowledge uttered a racial slur in her life. She had friends, associates, really, who were black, Latino, Asian. That had to mean something, didn't it? But now, as she sat alone in a cramped room inside Carter Aviation's training facility, staring at the thick binder labeled Bias Awareness and Equity Training, she wondered if any of that had ever really mattered. Because for the first time in her life, Margaret was being forced to look in the mirror. And she didn't like what she saw. The quiet undoing. She had spent her first week of suspension avoiding the obvious. She told herself she was being punished for a single mistake. That she had simply been unlucky. Caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. But then, the documents arrived. A file from Carter Aviation's HR department. It contained complaints, dozens from passengers over the years. Not formal enough to get her fired. Not loud enough to demand attention. But there, nonetheless, patterns. A woman who had felt ignored when she asked for a blanket. A businessman who had been asked to show his ticket twice while the white man beside him had been greeted with a smile. A mother who had been spoken to in clipped, dismissive tones while the couple across the aisle had been showered with warmth. None of these incidents had seemed wrong to Margaret at the time. None of them had registered as anything at all. And yet, now she could see them for what they were. They were choices. Her choices. And if she had made these choices so effortlessly, so unconsciously, then what did that say about the person she had been? The room of reckoning. Margaret sat in a conference room on the second floor of the training facility. Surrounded by 10 other employees. All here for the same reason. Some of them were like her flight attendants who had been accused of unconscious bias and sent here to reflect. Some were customer service agents. A few were middle managers from various departments. And then there was the instructor, a woman named Dr. Celeste Harmon, who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen this all before. Dr. Harmon was in her late 50s. Her gray-streaked hair cropped short. Her sharp brown eyes scanning the room like a teacher assessing her most difficult students. Margaret avoided her gaze. The session began, and at first, it was the usual corporate fluff: statistics on workplace bias. Slides showing demographic breakdowns. Explanations about systemic inequality. Margaret kept her arms crossed. Her expression neutral. She had heard all this before. But then Dr. Harmon did something unexpected. She pulled up a video. It was security footage. From an airplane. Margaret's airplane. And there on the screen, in grainy black and white, was her. Standing over Layla Monroe. Telling her she didn't belong. Margaret felt her breath hitch. She wasn't ready for this. The unspoken truth. The video played in silence. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. There was no screaming, no grand confrontation. But that almost made it worse. Because what it showed was ordinary. A routine dismissal. A quiet, seamless act of exclusion. Margaret watched as she saw herself, her own face. Her own gestures. Her own polite but firm tone ushering Layla Monroe out of first class. She watched how Layla had hesitated. How she had looked around for anyone to intervene. How no one had. How Margaret had stood there, unshaken, certain she was in the right. Until she wasn't. The video ended. Dr. Harmon turned to the group. Her expression unreadable. "Let's talk about what we just saw," she said. Silence. A man in a suit shifted uncomfortably. A younger woman scribbled something in her notebook. Margaret said nothing. She wanted to disappear. "You all work in customer service." Dr. Harmon continued, folding her arms. "Tell me what was wrong with that interaction." Another silence. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. Then, slowly, a man in the back, one of the airline's gate agents, spoke. "The passenger had a ticket," he said. "She was supposed to be there." Dr. Harmon nodded. "And yet?" The man hesitated. "She was treated like she wasn't," he said finally. Dr. Harmon turned to Margaret. "And why do you think that happened?" Margaret felt every pair of eyes in the room shift to her. She swallowed. Her throat was dry. The words stuck. Because the truth was sitting there. Raw and undeniable. And for the first time, she didn't have the shield of corporate language to hide behind. She couldn't say she had just been following procedure. She couldn't say she hadn't meant to do it. Because the footage didn't lie. And neither did Layla Monroe's face. Margaret exhaled, her fingers curling against the table. "I assumed," she said, barely above a whisper. Dr. Harmon leaned forward. "Assumed what?" Margaret looked down at her hands. She had spent so much of her life assuming. Assuming who belonged. Assuming who didn't. Assuming that fairness was something that happened naturally. Rather than something that had to be actively protected. She had assumed that she was different, that she wasn't one of those people. But now, she wasn't so sure. "I assumed she wasn't supposed to be there," she admitted finally. Dr. Harmon didn't nod, didn't offer comfort. She simply let the truth settle. And then she said, "Now, let's talk about why." The slow climb. Margaret didn't leave the session feeling redeemed. There was no neat resolution. No grand speech about how she had learned her lesson. Instead, she left feeling exposed. Because change wasn't about saying sorry. It wasn't about checking a box or completing a seminar. It was about unlearning. And unlearning was slow. Unlearning was painful. Margaret walked out of the building into the open air, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had spent years thinking she understood power. Now, she was beginning to understand something else. What it meant to lose it. And what it would take to earn it back. Margaret Hill had always believed that time could smooth over mistakes. That the world moved too fast for any one moment to linger. That if she kept her head down, if she waited long enough, the storm would pass, and she would be allowed to return to the life she had before. But time had not moved the way she expected. It had stretched. It had forced her to sit inside the silence of her own making. To listen to voices she had never taken seriously. To replay that moment on the plane again and again, not as a single mistake, but as a reflection of something larger. Now, 3 months later, she stood outside Carter Aviation's headquarters, staring up at the glass doors. Her reflection warped against the surface. She had been asked to return. Not as an employee. Not yet. As a question. A test. And for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't sure if she was ready for the answer. The final meeting. She walked into the building, her shoes clicking against the polished floor, her stomach a tight coil of uncertainty. The receptionist glanced up, nodded. "Mr. Monroe is expecting you." Margaret nodded back, her throat dry, and followed the familiar path to the conference room, the same one where, months ago, she had first faced the truth of what she had done. But this time, something was different. She was different. She could feel it in the way she carried herself. Not lighter, heavier. Because understanding the truth of herself had not lifted a burden, it had added one. She stepped inside. Elijah Monroe sat at the head of the table, composed as ever, his presence a quiet force. And beside him Layla. Margaret hesitated, but there was no turning back. She took a seat across from them, resting her hands on the table. Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. You completed the training. A statement, not a question. Margaret nodded. And what did you learn? She had expected this question. She had prepared answers about bias, about privilege, about the unconscious decisions people make every day. But none of that seemed right now. Because the truth, the real truth, was something she had only just begun to understand. She took a slow breath. I learned, she said, that I don't get to decide when I'm done learning. A flicker of something passed over Elijah's face. Margaret continued. I used to think that being fair was enough. She said, that as long as I followed the rules, I was doing my job. But I wasn't just following the rules. I was making choices. Choices that hurt people. Choices I didn't even think about. She turned to Layla. And I hurt you. Layla didn't shift, didn't lean back or look away. She held Margaret's gaze, waiting. Margaret inhaled. I can't undo what I did. She said, I can't take back the way I made you feel that day. But I can promise that if I come back, I will never be that person again. And if I fail, if I slip, I want people to hold me accountable. Elijah watched her, measured her. The silence in the room grew. Then finally Layla spoke. Her voice was even, controlled. You were sure of yourself when you told me I didn't belong. She said, are you that sure about this? Margaret felt her pulse quicken. But she didn't hesitate. Yes. Layla nodded, slowly. Then, she turned to her father. Elijah exhaled, leaned back in his chair, and folded his hands in front of him. You will return under probation, he said. No leadership role, no automatic reinstatement. You will prove yourself every day. With every passenger, with every choice you make. Margaret nodded. Elijah's eyes darkened slightly. And you will carry this weight, he continued, because it does not leave you. It does not fade. You will not get to walk away from it. Because that's not how this works. Margaret swallowed, but she nodded again. She understood now. This wasn't a return to her old life. That life was gone. This was something new, something harder, something heavier. And for the first time, Margaret Hill knew she was ready to carry it.